Hi BookTube, welcome to another Middlemarch meditation. Although today's reading, we're nowhere near Middlemarch. We are in Italy, specifically in Rome, specifically in the Vatican Museum. And this is the restart of a story thread that we left behind, wait for it, a year ago. Yes, on the 4th of August, 2024, we finished chapter 10, which ended by telling us that Dorothea Brooke had married Mr. Casaubon and they were taking their honeymoon in Rome. Now, I would say that we're rejoining them, but the truth is we're really going to spy on them. And this is a short chapter today, so we're going to finish all of chapter 19 because it's not very long. I will read through the whole chapter first, and what I will do, because I was late with this episode, is that while I am reading, I will treat you to some photographs that I took inside and around Hereford Cathedral, because of course I was in Hereford at the weekend and I went to visit the cathedral because I'd been told to visit it many, many times and had never got round to it, and now I have. So I'll share those pictures with you while we read. L'altra vedete che ha fatto alla guancia della sua palma, sospirando letto. When George IV was still reigning over the privacies of Windsor, when the Duke of Wellington was Prime Minister and Mr. Vincy was Mayor of the old corporation in Middlemarch, Mrs. Casaubon, born Dorothea Brooke, had taken her wedding journey to Rome. In those days, the world in general was more ignorant of good and evil by 40 years than it is at present. Travellers did not often carry full information on Christian art either in their heads or their pockets, and even the most brilliant English critic of the day mistook the flower-flushed tomb of the Ascended Virgin for an ornamental vase due to the painter's fancy. Romanticism, which has helped to fill some dull blanks with love and knowledge, had not yet penetrated the times with its leaven and entered into everybody's food. It was fermenting still, as a distinguishable, vigorous enthusiasm in certain long-haired German artists at Rome, and the youth of other nations who worked or idled near them were sometimes caught in the spreading movement. One fine morning, a young man whose hair was not immoderately long, but abundant and curly, and who was otherwise English in his equipment, had just turned his back on the Belvedere torso in the Vatican and was looking out on the magnificent view of the mountains from the adjoining round vestibule. He was sufficiently absorbed not to notice the approach of a dark-eyed, animated German who came up to him and, placing a hand on his shoulder, said with a strong accent, "Come here, quick, else she will have changed her pose." Quickness was ready at the call, and the two figures passed lightly along by the Mélianger towards the hall where the reclining Ariadne, then called the Cleopatra, lies in the marble voluptuousness of her beauty, the drapery folding around her with a petal-like ease and tenderness. They were just in time to see another figure standing against a pedestal near the reclining marble, a breathing, blooming girl whose form, not shamed by the Ariadne, was clad in Quakerish grey drapery. Her long cloak, fastened at the neck, was thrown backward from her arms, and one beautiful, ungloved hand pillowed her cheek, pushing somewhat backward the white beaver bonnet, which made a sort of halo to her face around the simply braided dark brown hair. She was not looking at the sculpture, probably not thinking of it. Her large eyes were fixed dreamily on a streak of sunlight which fell across the floor. But she became conscious of the two strangers who suddenly paused as if to contemplate the Cleopatra, and, without looking at them, immediately turned away to join a maidservant and courier who were loitering along the hall at a little distance off. "What do you think of that for a fine bit of antithesis?" said the German, searching in his friend's face for responding admiration, But going on volubly, without waiting for any other answer, there lies antique beauty, not corpse-like even in death, but arrested in the complete contentment of its sensuous perfection. And here stands beauty in its breathing life, with the consciousness of Christian centuries in its bosom. But she should be dressed as a nun. I think she looks almost what you call a Quaker. I would dress her as a nun in my picture. However, she is married. I saw her wedding ring on that wonderful left hand. Otherwise, I should have thought the sallow Geistlicher was her father. I saw him parting from her a good while ago, and just now I found her in that magnificent pose. Only think, he is perhaps rich and would like to have her portrait taken. Ah! It is no use looking after her. There she goes. Let us follow her home. No, no, said his companion, with a little frown. You are singular, Ladislaw. You look struck together. Do you know her? I know that she is married to my cousin, said Will Ladislaw, sauntering down the hall with a preoccupied air, while his German friend kept at his side and watched him eagerly. What? The Geistlicher? He looks more like an uncle. A more useful sort of relation. He is not my uncle. I tell you, he is my second cousin, said Ladislaw, with some irritation. Schön, schön, don't be snappish. You are not angry with me for thinking Mrs. Second Cousin the most perfect Madonna I ever saw. Angry? Nonsense. I have only seen her once before, for a couple of minutes, when my cousin introduced her to me, just before I left England. They were not married then. I didn't know they were coming to Rome. But you will go to see them now. You will find out what they have for an address, since you know the name. Shall we go to the post, and you could speak about the portrait? Confound you, Naumann. I don't know what I shall do. I am not so brazen as you. Bah! That is because you are dilettantish and amateurish. If you were an artist, you would think of Mistress Second Cousin as antique form, animated by Christian sentiment, a sort of Christian Antigone, sensuous force controlled by spiritual passion. Yes, and your painting of her was the chief outcome of her existence, the divinity passing into higher completeness and all but exhausted in the act of covering your bit of canvas. I am amateurish, if you like. I do not think that all the universe is straining towards the obscure significance of your pictures. But it is, my dear. So far as it is straining through me, Adolf Naumann, that stands firm, said the good-natured painter, putting a hand on Ladislaw's shoulder, and not in the least disturbed by the unaccountable touch of ill humor in his tone. See now, my existence presupposes the existence of the whole universe, does it not? And my function is to paint, and as a painter I have a conception which is altogether genialisch of your great-aunt or second-grandmother as a subject for a picture. Therefore, the universe is straining towards that picture through that particular hook or claw which is put forth in the shape of me. Not true? But how if another claw in the shape of me is straining to thwart it? The case is a little less simple then. Not at all. The result of the struggle is the same thing. Picture or no picture, logically. Will could not resist this imperturbable temper, and the cloud in his face broke into sunshiny laughter. Come now, my friend, you will help, said Naumann in a hopeful tone. No, nonsense, Naumann. English ladies are not at everybody's service as models, and you want to express too much with your painting. You would only have made a better or worse portrait with a background which every connoisseur would give a different reason for or against. And what is a portrait of a woman? Your painting and plastic are poor stuff, after all. They perturb and dull conceptions instead of raising them. Language is a finer medium. Yes, for those who can't paint, said Naumann. There, you have perfect right. I did not recommend you to paint, my friend. The amiable artist carried his sting, but Ladislaw did not choose to appear stung. He went on, as if he had not heard. Language gives a fuller image, which is all the better for being vague. After all, The true seeing is within, and painting stares at you with an insistent imperfection. I feel that especially about representations of women, as if a woman were a mere coloured superficies. You must wait for movement and tone. There is a difference in their very breathing. They change from moment to moment. This woman whom you have just seen, for example, how would you paint her voice, pray? But her voice is much diviner than anything you have seen of her. I see, you are jealous. No man must presume to think that he can paint your ideal. This is serious, my friend. Your great aunt, der Neversonkel, in a tragic sense, ungeheuer. You and I shall quarrel, Naumann, if you call that lady my aunt again. How is she to be called, then? Mrs. Casaubon. Good. Suppose I get acquainted with her in spite of you, and find that she very much wishes to be painted. Yes, suppose, said Will Ladislaw in a contemptuous undertone, intended to dismiss the subject. He was conscious of being irritated by ridiculously small causes, which were half of his own creation. Why was he making any fuss about Mrs. Casaubon? And yet he felt as if something had happened to him with regard to her. There are characters which are continually creating collisions and nodes for themselves in dramas which nobody is prepared to act with them. Their susceptibilities will clash against objects that remain innocently quiet. Right, everyone, hope you enjoyed those photographs, and hope you enjoyed the fact that Will Ladislaw is also back with us, so we're going to get to know something more about him. Now, of course, we start the chapter with an epigraph, and it's a loaded epigraph. It comes from Dante's Divine Comedy, from the 7th canto of Purgatory. And it's funny, you know that, of course, I just reviewed Matthew Pearl's novel, The Dante Club. And while I had misgivings about the novel, Matthew Pearl did write his PhD thesis about Dante. And so I did feel that he brought that knowledge to the book, and I probably should have said that. He certainly made me very, very interested in reading a translation of the Divine Comedy. So don't be surprised if in 2026, when I finished War and Peace and I'm looking around for another long reading project that needs time, that needs slow reading, if that doesn't turn out to be the Divine Comedy. The quote that I'm going to show you on screen now comes from a very special website. It comes from Columbia University. They've put together a digital Dante website, and it's a fantastic resource. Please see the description box for my link there. Not only do they have the full text in both languages, but they allow access to video lectures from what appears to be a year-long course focusing on the Divine Comedy. So now I'm really tempted to make this a 2026 project. But I'm digressing. I rehearsed my reading of the epigraph by listening to a video with an audio recitation in Italian. And again, there'll be a link to that in my description box so you can listen to the full canto. And if you get to the timestamp between 6 minutes and 6 minutes 15, you will hear the reader go through the epigraph section. But let's talk about this 7th canto of Purgatory. Dante is looking down on the residents of this middle place between heaven and hell, and his guide is drawing his attention to 2 former rulers who have died. And we probably won't know them unless you are really into the early Holy Roman Empire and its rulers. I doubt you would know the Emperor Rudolph I, who ruled in the 13th century, and his contemporary Ottokar II of Bohemia. Okay, these men became related by marriage. This is the sum of it. Ottokar's son married Rudolph's daughter, Judith. And while I would have loved to have done a more in-depth study of the lives of these men and speculate on what were Dante's reasons for believing they needed to be in purgatory, today's meditation, it's going to be rich enough in material. So if you wanted to look into that, you can look up both kings on Wikipedia. Perhaps you can find some more resources and learn a bit more about their life. For now, let's just accept that Rudolph and Ottokar find themselves in this dismal place, and Eliot chooses a quote which describes how they are affected by their surroundings and by the contemplation of their past lives and deeds. So if I read the English translation now, who we are talking about at first is Rudolph. So when Dante says, see how he beats his breast there, that's Emperor Rudolph. Then the translation goes on, and you see the other shade, that is Ottokar. You see the other shade who, as he sighs, would rest his cheek upon his palm as on a bed. And I think the only reason for using this quote is just for that image of someone resting their cheek on the palm of their hand, because we saw that as I read the text, and as I go on to comment about it, we'll refer back. So let's talk about the rest of page 188, the opening page of the chapter. First of all, the quote about William IV reigning over the privacies of Windsor. William IV had to take over from his father, George III, and he ruled as a regent. And that's why we call that period of the early 19th century the Regency period, because he was standing in George III by then, his illness, which had caused his madness, that famed madness, had made him less and less able to carry out his duties. And so William IV took over, but was never considered to be a very good ruler. And so the fact that Eliot says that he was reigning over the privacies of Windsor probably meant that as far as his authority really extended, it probably didn't get much past the palace in real terms. Of course, it'd be interesting to know. I have never read a more detailed history of the Regency to find out, okay, so who was actually running the country and how was it run to what degree was William IV an absent king? And then there's this phrase the narrator uses where he says, ignorant of good and evil by 40 years. And I thought, what? Very odd. The only way I could make sense of it was to think maybe Eliot is comparing England to the Garden of Eden before Adam and Eve partook of that fruit which gave them the knowledge of good and evil. So maybe she's in a way saying, oh, there was a time when, England was quite innocent of worldly knowledge, because then she goes on to say about how people wouldn't have had an understanding of Christian art and all would be just another worldly thing they wouldn't really have had much exposure to. That's my only interpretation of it. The notes in the back of the book didn't really have anything helpful to say, couldn't find anything online. So if anybody has any suggestions, feel free to comment. And next, Eliot's narrator mentions the most brilliant English critic of the day. Without naming that critic, she wouldn't have needed to at the time the book sold. But now, of course, we're all wondering who this is. Well, this is William Hazlitt. And I have mentioned him before. But before I talk about that, let's just remind ourselves, he was probably the first person in England to make art and literary criticism a profession of sorts. He didn't make much money, so I don't know. You could argue not much of a profession that he made, but nevertheless, Eliot's narrator is at pains to show us that England's best critic at the time wasn't, in fact, very knowledgeable, and he wasn't. Hazlitt was an interesting character. He seems like one of those self-made types who tries to do a little bit of everything and has a moderate success, but more failures than successes, because he's really actually rather opinionated and thinks more of his knowledge. And if you remember my review of the novel The Far Side of a Kiss, that was a fictional retelling of a real event. Hazlitt, in his later life, had an infatuation with a 19-year-old servant girl. He was 45 at the time, so a little bit like the age gap between Dorothea and Mr. Casaubon. But I don't know that Eliot wants us to pay attention to that particularly. I think she's just using Hazlitt as an example of a man who made himself an art critic, but really did not have the knowledge to call himself that. And where, page 188, we get to that phrase, certain long-haired German artists in Rome, these are the Nazarenes. Now, in 1810, there was a group of students at the Vienna Academy who moved to Rome, and their aim was to reintroduce spirituality into painting. They were looking to late medieval and early Renaissance art for their inspiration. And the label Nazarene, they didn't coin that. Obviously, that was what other people called them, mostly to make fun of them. They were making fun of their religious enthusiasm. But the movement grew, and it did receive some important commissions. to produce religious frescoes, for example. Now, a little further on here in the text, I don't know why Eliot felt it was important to say about Adolf Naumann that he said what he said with a strong accent. I thought, does this bother anyone else or just me? Everyone has an accent. I did not attempt to convey an accent when I read the text because I could not produce an accent that would not annoy you as readers. Some writers alter their spelling to try and affect and the sounds of an accent. I'm happy when they do that to convey a dialect of a language, but I don't like it when they try to convey an accent by changing spelling, because when they do that, the effect, it feels like it's making fun of a character that maybe you don't want to entirely make fun of. So I don't find someone's accent anyway to be funny. It's not a comic thing for me. The English translation of War and Peace, by the way, does that. And I would be interested to know whether Tolstoy in Russian did anything like that. I don't know. I must ask. Cams Campbell comes to mind. Maybe I should ask him if Tolstoy also did this horrible business of trying to write a spelling that imitated an accent. And then finally, page 188, it's referred to, there's a statue in the Vatican Museum of Ariadne, also called Cleopatra, which I thought was curious. But first of all, for those who may not be familiar with Ariadne, and I wasn't familiar with the details, so I'm going to read from my copy of, I hope you can see this is Bullfinch's Mythology, page 119, where it says, "We have seen in the story of Theseus how Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos, after helping Theseus to escape from the labyrinth, was carried by him to the island of Naxos and was left there asleep, while the ungrateful Theseus pursued his way home without her. Ariadne, on waking and finding herself deserted, abandoned herself to grief." And so the statue that's in the Vatican, and I will put up a picture of that now, either shows Ariadne asleep or Ariadne overcome by her grief at being abandoned, but possibly asleep. And that may be why the statue was also called Cleopatra at the time Eliot wrote Middlemarch, because there would have been a collective memory of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, where Mark Antony, knowing that he lost the war against Octavius Caesar and thinking that Cleopatra is already dead, he asks one of his aides to run him through with a sword. But Cleopatra is not dead. And so when she finds out that Mark Antony has died, she herself commits suicide. So it could have been that people either saw the statue as the sleeping Ariadne or the dead Cleopatra. And we see how excited Naumann is as he leads Ladislaw back to the place where the statue is located, and they spy on Dorothea looking at the statue. And she is standing, Dorothea is, with one of her hands resting against her cheek, referring back, of course, to the epigraph from Dante. But it's also clear that her face is a whole, and her pose are completely different. Ariadne, the statue, as you can see again in the picture, is fast asleep. Her arm is flung over her head in one case, but she does also have her face resting against a hand as well. So there's that double image there. Let me just put up a little table on screen as well to show some of the differences, the contrasts, the antithesis, if you will, between the statue and Dorothea, because of course now uses the word antithesis. He's so excited about that, the difference between the statue and the woman looking at the statue. So if I put the table up here, you can see the statue depicts either sleep or death, or at least depicts someone who is antique, someone who is dead now, whereas Dorothea, of course, is a living woman. The statue is sensuous. The angles, the very lack of clothing on the body is meant to be sensuous. Whereas Dorothea, of course, we know is dressed very modestly. She's in grey. Will have a floor-length dress, a floor-length cape that would, if you saw her from the back, would completely cover her so that you wouldn't even see her shape, her body shape. And she has a white beaver bonnet, and I'll pause for a moment to show you a picture of what that bonnet might have looked like. This is what was in our thumbnail for today's video, because I did think it was so well done, the BBC, to put this particular headpiece on her, because it looks like a halo. It's beautiful. And again, creates that sense of virginity, makes, again, Naumann talks about he would dress her as a nun, and I wonder if the bonnet inspired him, that and the grey dress made him think of a nun's habit. If we go back to the table again now, the statue represents classical morality, which was perceived in the 19th century to be just a little not good, a little not as good as Christian morality, which is what Dorothea represents. And if we were talking about Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, and I did immediately think of this as I was reading Middlemarch, I thought, oh my goodness, this contrast that Naumann is so excited about is the contrast that Thomas Mann chooses to portray by creating the characters of Settembrini, who represents the Ariadne, the classical morality, and Naphtha, who is the Jesuit, who would represent more modern Christian morality. So those two were created as the same kind of antithesis, and I felt I just had to mention that because I was so excited that came to mind at the time. Also, there are paintings by the Nazarenes, and I'm going to show you one in particular, so we got to move away from the table again. This is a painting by Victor Orsel, which is called Good and Evil, and you can see that there are two women, of course there are, all lessons about evil and the lessons learned from evil so often tend to involve women and their sexuality. Good heavens, that's always a problem. But as you can see, the woman who is depicted as evil is also very sensuous and not very attentive to the lessons of the church that are trying to teach her, whereas the depiction of good is very attentive and does everything it's told, and doesn't is modest. The statue, of course, we know had a mortal lover. Theseus was Ariadne's lover, although she did acquire a second because the god Dionysius came and found her on the island of Naxos. So eventually she had an immortal lover. Now, Dorothea is the same. This is actually not an antithesis. She has a mortal lover, if you like, and that's Mr. Casaubon, her husband. But in the fact that Naumann wishes to portray her as a nun, you could say, if he does so, he's implying that she has an immortal lover, because all nuns are married to Jesus Christ. And finally, I believe that George Eliot, in creating this scene with the two characters, Adolf Naumann and Will Ladislaw, is creating an antithesis between the two characters as well. So Naumann, with his good humor, I put him more on Ariadne's side with that classical morality. He's responding to his artistic sensibilities. He's responding to the beauty of the statue, but also Dorothea's beauty. Ladislaw, who's being a little bit more ill-humored, does remind me a little bit more of Naphtha and Dorothea herself. She would have objected had she heard Naumann speaking like this. It would have upset her. And Ladislaw, perhaps for as little as he knows about Dorothea, must have sensed enough to think, no, she's not going to be happy with being approached in that way. Naumann has noticed, however, that Dorothea has been in the company of a clergyman. That's why he uses the German word Geistlicher, which refers to someone who works in the clergy. But he doesn't realize that that's her husband. He assumes it's some other relative. And then comes this strange little exchange, which will remind you a lot of a similar one a year ago between Dorothea's uncle, Mr. Brooke, and Mr. Casaubon, when they were talking about Ladislaw, and Mr. Brooke accidentally referred to Ladislaw as Casaubon's nephew, and oh my goodness, that was not acceptable. And Mr. Casaubon corrected him immediately. Ladislaw does the same thing. Naumann accidentally refers to Casaubon as Ladislaw's uncle, and Ladislaw is touchy, just as touchy as Mr. Casaubon was, and says, no, not my uncle, we're cousins. Again, I can't help but think this is a means of stressing we're not close. Don't make us any closer than we absolutely have to be, because we're not close personally. And then if we go to the top of page 190, Naumann is wondering, what what is all this bad temper about? So he says, schön, schön. He's just saying, I agree, or I'm interpreting that as indeed, of course, like, I'm soothing you now because I don't know why you're in this state of mind. I don't know why you've suddenly become ill-tempered. But then Ladislaw denies this negative emotion. He says, angry? Nonsense. And yet we know what he says about himself at the end of the chapter. And then Naumann begins to talk about what he sees in Dorothea, and he speaks of her as a Christian Antigone. Now, we're going to unpack that a little bit. If you're not familiar with the character of Antigone, here's a quick recap. Antigone was the daughter of Oedipus, the ruler of Thebes. Now, after the death of Oedipus, the city was ruled by Antigone's two brothers, and initially they were supposed to agree to take turns. That was how it was. Right? But you can imagine how these things go in families. One brother came to the end of his turn, but he wasn't willing to step down. So the other brother, Polynices, had to flee. He went away, he gathered himself an army, and he came back to attack the city of Thebes. Both brothers were killed in the fighting. However, Polynices died outside the walls of the city. And there was a new king named Creon who took control of Thebes. King Creon issued a proclamation which forbade anyone to carry out the customary funeral rites for Polynices. It meant treating his body with oil and herbs and having it buried in a certain place. Greeks had customs around that, and family members were normally obligated to carry out those rituals, or else you couldn't be sure what would happen to your loved one in the afterlife. Now, Antigone defied the proclamation of the new king. She crept out of the city walls after dark, and she attended to her brother's body. And she stayed with that body after it was buried until the next day, when guards came and captured her, and she was arrested. And then she's taken to the king. He confronts her, and they argue about what takes precedence. Is the morality of spiritual and familial tradition, is that stronger, or is the morality of civic law what should come first? And everybody, you might be thinking, wait a second, that scarf is different. Lots of things are different. The book's in the background. Yes, we had a little problem with our filming, and that's why you suddenly see a difference with this clip. This clip is being filmed 24 hours later. I'd like to continue with the story of Antigone. So what we understand is that these two figures had a fundamental difference. And this relates to Dorothea. I suppose what Naumann is thinking is that Dorothea would stand for Christian morality regardless of any argument for the precedence of an older morality in classicism. I don't know exactly what Naumann means when he compares her, but perhaps that's how he's seeing her artistically. This is, after all, his personal interpretation of what she might symbolize and therefore how he might paint her. But going back to my table, we can't really comment on this contrast between Dorothea and the statue of Ariadne and everything that Dorothea represents and all this antithesis going on without talking about the antithesis that is portrayed between Ladislaw and Naumann, because Naumann is representing, I suppose, the more classical sensibility. He's being moved by his emotion. He's being moved by the sensual beauty of the statue, but also by Dorothea's beauty, absolutely. Ladislaw seems to be sitting on the opposite side. And so this unaccountable touch of ill humor in Ladislaw, it suggests that he isn't normally like this. And it's funny, back when we first met Ladislaw, I had him pegged as a romantic. And I think he is, or he is trying to be. But Naumann accuses him, and perhaps rightly, of being a dilettante and an amateur at the whole business of romanticism, that he doesn't truly understand how to free himself from the restraints of a Christian morality, but of course it ties in with English cultural morality in some ways. And Naumann is accusing Ladislaw, you don't really understand how this romantic view of the world is supposed to work in your life, because you're so hung up about the way I am looking at this statue and this woman. And Naumann uses an interesting German word, which I hope I pronounce correctly because I certainly practiced a great deal, genialisch, which the sense that I got online was that it was about brilliance, that the idea that Naumann had, he credits it with great brilliance, perhaps with genius. And that also ties in with the romantic idea that the artist and his impulses are chief, that they're almost connected directly to the divine or to nature, because these two things were often seen as equal. And so Naumann, it's interesting that he himself stands in one position and Ladislaw in another philosophically, as well as just the two friends having a difference of opinion about this young lady, which Naumann does not know, but Ladislaw, well, he does not know either, and yet he seems to believe he does. And now we go to page 191, where there's this phrase that Ladislaw uses, because Naumann is all ready to say, Ladislaw, show me where your relatives live. Now that if you know them, let's go to their house and let's ask if they would like their portrait painted. And Ladislaw now has to give Naumann a cultural lesson in why England was just this little bit different. And I'm no expert, but I do know that artists, female models in England were almost always working class. And because class mattered so much, an upper class English lady would consider it an insult to be asked to pose as a model, because you were effectively asking her to do something which was associated with the working class, therefore also associated with the perceived morality of the working class. And for working class women, their sexual morality was perceived to be more accommodating. I think this was just an excuse invented by upper class English men to take advantage of working class women. But be that as it may, for an upper class woman, let's say Rosamund Vincy, you can tell how well trained she has been in that finishing school she went to, that she won't even use words which are more associated with working class speech, because that is common. And in the same way, any lady in England at the time would have considered any kind of behavior that was associated more with the working class to be something to avoid, because people would draw from that the conclusion that you might be wanting to behave like the working class in other aspects, moral aspects. And you might have been curious when Will Ladislaw uses the word plastic, which he does at the top of page 191. You might be thinking, there was no plastic, was there, in the earth? No, there was not. It had not been invented. The word, I think, in German, in relation to art, I think that referred to, and if David from Polyglot Reading is watching, please correct me if this isn't true, can refer to any medium that you can mold or model, right? And I'm told that can include paint. And I suppose because with oil paint, it's quite stiff as an art medium. So yes, you can kind of mold it and model it, particularly if you're working with a palette knife. But plastic could apply to art made with clay from molten metal, I presume. Maybe stone? I know stone doesn't really, but you do. When you chip away with it, you are effectively molding and modeling it. The point Ladislaw seems to be getting at is that visual art that is just you looking at a surface, that it's less capable of capturing something as complex as a portrait of a woman. And then Naumann starts to perceive from Ladislaw's ill-tempered comments that maybe he's jealous of his uncle, who isn't his uncle, Mr. Casaubon, jealous because he desires Dorothea. And so Naumann thinks, oh, there's a literary precedent for this, and that's why he mentions Der Neffe als Onkel, because he's referring to a play by Friedrich Schiller, and that would have been very popular in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And the main character is Captain Frank de Dorsigny, who is in love with his uncle's fiancée. And so he disguises himself as his own uncle in order to thwart the marriage from going ahead so that his cousin Sophia would marry him instead. Now, it would take some effort for Ladislaw to change his appearance enough so that Dorothea would mistake him for Casaubon, but that's not why Naumann's referring to the play. He's just thinking, oh my goodness, here's a situation, and he uses the word ungeheuer, which, I know that has a lot of meanings, but I think what Naumann is saying is, oh my goodness, here's a situation very much like Schiller's play, except more monstrous, more horrible, more awful, probably because he thinks Dorothea should not be married to Casaubon. That seems to be the gist, is like, no, surely she can't be married to that older man. Oh, what a horrible thing, and that you should desire her, and she probably should be married to you. I think that's why he's saying ungeheuer. He's just like, oh, no, bad situation, definitely. Eliot's narrator ends this chapter with a sentence that I sort of put my head on one side and thought, I'm not sure I'm following where that's going. It's a sentence that reads, there are characters which are continually creating collisions and nodes for themselves in dramas which nobody is prepared to act with them. Now, the passage seems to suggest that this is Will Ladislaw feeling that something has happened to him since he met Dorothea, and that he's inventing a connection between the two of them, or something that had happened. But I'm not sure if that's what the narrator is saying. Ladislaw, he's not clear why he's reacting so strongly. His unusual response suggests that there's an emotion that he's not yet aware of. And so I think I'm just going to wait, and I'm going to let the book help me understand that last sentence a bit better, because Will Ladislaw hasn't struck me yet, maybe I don't know him very well, as someone who kind of invents dramas that he can take part in. But maybe that is what Eliot is trying to warn us about through the narrator, that Will is a bit like that. He may not, like Naumann, see works of art when he glances at someone, but maybe like Naumann, he has now invented a whole play or a novel in his mind unconsciously. And that novel has himself and Dorothea as principal characters. Let's find out. That is the end of Middlemarch Meditations for this week, late as it is. You know, the next one is probably going to be late as well. There's just stuff going on at the weekends, and that's when I get the best time to film and edit these meditations. So bear with me. If you get a tag video on Sunday, you'll know it's because, Heather needs a bit more time to do the next Middlemarch meditation, but we will definitely get you the second meditation before August finishes, because I like to be tidy and fit that in. So we'll start with chapter 20 next time. In the meantime, everybody, fantastic reading. If you're having a break or a holiday somewhere, hope you're having a great time, and I'll see you again in a few days. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.